Okay, so a quick note that we are recording and that the recording will be published on our YouTube channel, History at Newcastle. And over to you, Umit.
All right. Thank you so much, Steve, Sasha. And thank you all of you for being with us. And I would like to express my special gratitude to Sasha, especially for organizing and bringing all these wonderful scholars and historians together with me. And I'm really happy to make this event happen with him. It would have been impossible without him. So let's, after having had a wonderful first session, and I think the second panel will be the same. And I would like to start with my dear colleague Spiros, and let me introduce him briefly. So Spiros, Dr. Spiros Tsoutsoumpis is a lecturer in modern European history at the University of Manchester and a visiting lecturer at Lancaster University. His first monograph, A History of the Greek Resistance in the Second World War I, The People's Armies, which was a fascinating, actually, monograph about the subject matter, was published by Manchester University Press in 2016. Spiros is currently working on a new manuscript that examines the intersection between paramilitary violence and state building in the Greek new lens between the Balkan Wars and the Cold War. And Spiros is actually with me now, so we are together in Athens conducting our DICRA research in different archives in Athens. So I will give the floor to Spiros.
Hi everyone, and thank you very much for inviting me to this fascinating conference. And many thanks to me for your very generous introduction. So today, what I would like to talk about is military enterprising and violence in the late Ottoman period. I would like to begin with a short story. In 1907 was a very violent year in Ottoman Macedonia. Greeks, the Bulgarians, the Ottomans, the Albanians, the Romanians, everyone was sponsoring armed organizations in order to contest the supremacy of the area. And usually this violence that sometimes took an extreme aspect has been analyzed through the lens of ethnicity. People took part in it because they were inspired by a specific ethnic agenda. They enacted atrocities because they were blinded by the nationalist prejudice. And of course, after the Balkan Wars and even up until today, these people are seen as national heroes or traitors, depending on which side you look at. But in 1907, very interesting man and a very ideological fighter, Tsodos Vardas, a Cretan and a professional officer, was crossing the Greek-Ottoman border. And this, he was held by a local peasant, Michael, who had owned a small coffee shop, was a part-time smuggler, part-time bandit, and a full-time businessman of war. Vardas recalls how people crossed the border from one side to the other. They needed guns, they needed shelter, they needed food, they needed all kinds of things. And Michael was always there to offer them. Sometimes he sided with the Greeks, often he turned a blind eye with the Bulgarians. Sometimes he got money from the Ottomans to denounce, well, everyone that could, give him a profit. And Vardas wrote, that for Michael, for men like him, war has become a business, and business was becoming very good. Vardas lost touch after 1908, when the main phase of violence, at least Greek-sponsored violence, ended in Macedonia. He encountered Michael again in 1912 during the First Balkan War. And in 1914, there was another bout of violence, this time in what is present-day southern Albania. And Vardas once again organized irregular bands to enact violence for the Greek state. He was very surprised to see Michael and his fellow villagers and asked him, what are you doing here? And he said, Mr. Vardas, once, we took over these Ottoman lands, business has been so bad, so we had to, move up shop further up the border. This was the last military venture for Michael. Later on, we have some vague information. He returned to his village, became a businessman, political entrepreneur for the monarchist party. This story, for me, encapsulates something that is overlooked during the Balkan Wars, during this late Ottoman violence. But war was not only conducted in the name of ideology. Of course, many people, including Umit, have challenged these top-down understandings. But the economics of violence, the social repercussions of violence, the social processes of this violence remain still overlooked. Michael, his story tells us three things actually. First, that people took part in violence for non-ideological reasons. Second, that in the process of conducting this violence, people slowly became nationalized. Michael first was willing to sell information to everybody. The Balkan Wars he sided with the Greek state, and later on as well. Third, he tells us that violence, taking part in violence, also helps to construct institutions from the top down. Border peasants like Michael did not become Greeks or Turks or Bulgarians or Albanians because they believed essentially in this ethnic agenda. They became nationalized because they profited from it. The violence created the violence of the late Ottoman period created what I will call a violent middle class of people, military entrepreneurs, who sided with the state for reasons of profit and sometimes of ideology. In the process of this violence, the people helped to rebuild the countryside along national lines through processes of looting, raiding, robbing, pillaging. This allowed Marxist terms, even though I'm not saying that I'm giving a Marxist explanation, a primitive accumulation of capital through violence means. For in the post-war period is then reinvested in businesses, in land, in real estate. This process, therefore, create a new middle class who nationalizes the borderlines, a new middle class who is created from the ground up. So my suggestion is, instead of looking through this violence and nationalization process through the lens of officers, of teachers, of propagandists, of historians, of the people of the state, it is more befitting to look at people like Michael and how they built the borderland, that this violent elite was created, and how it helped to create the state and provided legitimacy. Sometimes we think, the late Ottoman violence was brought about school teachers, propagandists. These people helped to turn Greeks and peasants into Greeks, peasants into Turks, to just quote a great book about state building in France. But the reality, at least in my research, indicates that this was a much more complex process. It happened because of interactions from the ground up and from the top down. And it was this role of these key people, these crucial military entrepreneurs, these people like Michael, who helped the state to extend its strength, to build up institutions, and to legitimize its presence, not only because the state represented an ideological agenda, but because the state represented power, profit, money, and social mobility. So having completed this small introduction, I'm going to, for the next 10 minutes or so, to encapsulate this paradigm, this military enterprising paradigm of the concept of the violent middle class by building on my own research. My own research focuses largely on the Greco-Albanian, Greco-Yugoslavic, Greco-Bulgarian borders in the Balkan, after the Second Balkan Wars, but also in the Greek-Ottoman border interactions in the eve of the Balkan Wars. Much of it focuses on what is today southern Albania, and southern Albania, northern Greece, and southern Bulgaria, northern Greece. While doing this research, I tried to find out, first, my intention was to understand who are the people who enacted violence for the state? Why did they enact violence for the state? And more crucially, what happens to these people after they enact violence? There is a huge literature, paramilitaries, entrepreneurs, military entrepreneurs, but most of this literature focuses on wartime. We know much less what happens when these people are demobilized. Indeed, do they demobilize? Now, we know from studies from Colombia, Peru, Latin America in general, paramilitaries never essentially demobilize, that they are there to help the state build up institutions. And that many of them, and we have, for instance, Colombia, where we have the so-called narco bourgeoisie, paramilitary society with the state against the left, made considerable gains. And after the war, they used the gains, the ties with the state, to create a new middle class, an upper middle class in places like Cartagena, Medellin, and so on. So this was my departure point, trying to understand what went on. And by looking at the profiles of the paramilitaries that were mobilized, especially on the Greek-Albanian border, both from the Greek and the Albanian side, I found that there were some ideological people. There was a number of officers, Ottoman officers, Albanian nationalists, but the overwhelming number of people were those like Michael. Many of them had no conception, no clear conception of the nation state. Many of them had a religious-based identity or a local-based identity. The question then comes, why did the state manage to mobilize them? What did they do? The case of, let's say, Michael or another famous local military entrepreneur, Nikiforos Kosivakis, who came from an upland village in Arta, it was very simple. They were poor. They came from marginal mountain areas. They have very good skills in enacting violence, have very good skills in tracking, being marksmen, being expert shots. Before the violence arrived, some of them linger in the mountains. Others immigrated to the cities where they work as charcoal makers, enforcers, debt collectors, day workers, and so on. Once the state arrives, then these people, these marginal, very mobilized and very mobile people are approached. Usually they're approached with their employees, and their employees is the local middle class, local upper middle class businessmen. And this businessman class plays a very important role. They're nationalistic, they're patriotic, and they create a link. They are the brokers who create a link between the violence entrepreneurs and the state. Once they are therefore mobilized, these people need to not just to fight, but to sustain, to keep the fighting going. Now, the late Ottoman state, despite its problems, it was a massive state that had resources. Greece was a very poor state, so was Bulgaria, so was Serbia. Albania was a nation in its infancy. Question is, who provides the money for the fighting? How do we pay these people? We cannot have them on budget. I mean, technically, there's no war situation. How do we keep them satisfied? And the answer for everyone was very simple. Racketeering, smuggling, raiding, robbing. The so-called national taxes, head taxes to individual peasants. So what we have therefore is that we have these marginal people under the protection of the state operating racketeering schemes, legal racketeering schemes. If you look at the archives, they'll say we tax the peasants for national reasons, and most of them are very happy to provide money. Some of them probably were, but effectively this was a mafia scheme because militias protected the people from other militias, but they protected people from themselves as well. So in a sense, they were a semi-patriotic soprano-style organization rather than a full-blown nationalist force. What is very interesting, of course, is that this illegal money flows could not be completely controlled, but they did not involve all the paramilitaries. They involved gun smugglers, merchants, people who ferried them in and out of a specific area. So slowly but steadily, the circle of perpetrators, the circle of participants extends. They are the men at arms in the field, the doctors, the smugglers, the gun makers, the boatmen, the ferrymen, the merchants, the lawyers and the judges who are paid to turn a blind eye, the gendarmes who are regularly bribed. By spreading the money, the circle of nationalists and of participants grows. We know by 1912, when the violence of relatively subsided in the Greco-Albanian border, we meet people like Michalis Kosivakis, or my favorite one, a guy called Yanis Poutetsis, having used this illegal means to acquire real estate in old Greece, in the Old Kingdom. Already some of them have been transformed from military entrepreneurs and raiders to de facto legitimate businessmen. Still, they do not live their illegal activities out. I found in the Greek archives again that this specific paramilitary, Michalis Poutetsis, was making about 1,000 golden sovereigns per year only through abductions and cigarette smuggling and other kinds of smuggling in the border. Of course, this process accelerates during the Balkan Wars. By the Balkan Wars, in this period of decade, we have the creation, therefore, of a very large circle of violent men and their participants, from the militias on the ground to smugglers, raiders, robbers, nationalist agitators. When the Balkan Wars break out, therefore, they are a ready-made contingency for the state. Greek state, the Bulgarian state, the Serbian state, they unite, but they do not have enough men. Militias are needed as force multipliers. and they are there. This circle of people is there. And of course, in 1912, in 1913, after the defeat of the Ottoman state, after the collapse of the Ottoman Empire in the Balkans, and after the Balkan states divide the area, more violence continues. Violence continues with the First World War and effectively ends with the Greco-Turkish War of 1922. The militias have been mobilized and remobilized again and again. By 1922. They present a problem with the state. What do we do with them? Have people who have been committing violent acts for 20 years, have been engaged in racketeering and robbery for 20 years. Do we disperse these groups? Do we integrate them? The answer is very complex. The 1920s in the Balkans, the post-Ottoman Balkans, was a period, at least in Greece and parts of Albania and Bulgaria, was associated with the rise in social banditry, would otherwise lots of people refuse to demobilize. Once again, the state turns to the outlaws. Some outlaws, some paramilitaries refuse to demobilize. Others are employed by the state as gendarmes, police officers, and they're used to crack down on the former comrades. But this is not only a tale of bandits. At the same time, the people now in the mid, late 30s, some of them in the early 40s, moved to the cities. They moved to the cities where they acquire real estate. They become also landowners in the countryside, businessmen. And now that the state has consolidated its presence against the Ottomans, they have to face other contestants, minorities. In the case of Greeks, Muslims, Jews, Slav speakers. The state needs to nationalize the area. And once again, the militias are immobilized. So the mobilization of these violent entrepreneurs does, in the area that I'm speaking about, three things. First, it allows the state to extend its reach. They act as force multipliers, and they help them to, commit the violence that drives out the Ottomans. Second, it creates a class of people, a violent middle class of people that are completely loyal to the state because they have earned a lot by the state. These people have broad circles of acquaintances, of clients, of kinsmen, of fellow comrades. So it creates a constituency that is faithful to the state, that gradually takes over the economic means from the old Ottoman ruling class. And finally, these people, these entrepreneurs of violence, are used in the post-Ottoman period once again to crack down against minorities, against the new enemy. The external enemy has been dealt with. The internal enemy is alive and well, not because they're so dangerous, but sometimes because an internal enemy is needed. Moving on from the interwar very quickly to the 1940s. The 1940s, for me, sometimes I conceptualize 1949, the end of the Greek Civil War, as the end of a long Balkan War. Once again, the cards change. The map in the Balkans changed. In the 1940s, it was, again, I conceptualize it, not simply as a war between the Axis and the Allies, the good and the bad, but again, it is a contest between the new violent middle class, disgruntled minorities, and the communist left that creates new political actors who are fed up with corruption, military enterprising, and so on. In some cases, you can see this. In Yugoslavia, they're the old fighters against the Ottomans who become the Chetniks. Sometimes they ally themselves with the Nazis to fight against the communist left. You see the same story in Bulgaria, in Greece, and in Albania to a greater or lesser extent. So ultimately, in the socialist bloc, these groups are eradicated. In Greece, they remain alive and well, thanks to American help, British help, and other social processes. So ultimately, going back to my first tale, Michalis, what happened to Michalis? Why should we study men like that? Why should we turn away from perpetrators of violence and look at economics, raiding and racketeering? Why should we bother about the acts of violence, economic violence that are sometimes seen as irrational or merely criminal? Sometimes they could be criminal. They're very seldom irrational, but they are very crucial. These forms of violence economies, military enterprising, played a key role in mobilizing violence against the Ottoman state. They played a key role in restructuring the state and reshaping the economy during the interwar period. And they were the key between the violence that erupted in the Balkans in this post-colonial, post-Ottoman space during the 1930s, when this class of military enterprises met their match in a class of new political enterprises, the communist left, the partisans, and the representatives. By looking therefore at people like Michalis, we can understand much more succinctly how and why the Ottoman state was contested, how the Ottoman space was rebuilt, what were the social, political, and military ramifications of this type of mobilization, of paramilitary mobilization, why violence erupted in the 1940s, and even looking back to the contemporary middle class and events in the Balkans, from people like Arkan in Serbia, violent entrepreneurs, from drug dealers to racketeers in Albania, in Greece, in Bulgaria. It gives us also, I think, a sense of the shape of things to come, how sometimes this experiences created a cultural continuum, a kind of symbiotic relationship between the state, the outlaws, non-state armed groups in society that lingers to this day, and it often has very serious ramifications for democracy. So that's the end of my presentation. Thank you very much for again for inviting me here today, and of course we welcome any questions. Thank you very much.
Okay. Thank you so much, Spiros. Our next panelist is Alexander Maxwell. Dr. Maxwell researches national awakening, the Habsburg and its successor states, and particularly Slovakia and Hungary during the long 19th century. He has published extensively on linguistic nationalism and the history of linguistic ideologies, the history of everyday life, particularly nationalized sexuality and the social history of clothing. He also publishes pedagogical articles about teaching history. His broader interests concern nationalism and cultural history in the Habsburg, Romanov, Hohenzollern, and the Ottoman empires and their successor states. He is also the director of the Antipodean East European Study Group. Alexander, please, floor is yours.
Thank you very much. So just to be sure, the screen is showing properly. You see one picture with the text on the left?
Yes.
Thank you very much. Okay, well, thank you very much for having me to this symposium, and I'm very glad to have a chance to speak. I'd like to talk today about Macedonia. But particularly, I'd like to talk about the idea of Macedonians deciding who they are in a national sense. So to illustrate the talk, I have this photograph of a Macedonian demonstration in, I think it's in Austria. We're not Slavs, Greeks, or Bulgarians, we're Macedonians. And what I'm particularly interested in for my talk is the not being Bulgarians. As far as Macedonians not being Greeks, this is not my issue. I'm interested in the Macedonian Bulgarian issue. Now, there's a couple of chronological questions to get out of the way. We're talking about this state, which is the Republic, now known as the Republic of North Macedonia. When it achieved independence, what do you call it, South Macedonia, that Greece rejected and had named behind it. The reason Greece rejected is because there is a Greek province in Macedonia just to the south. But the main story I want to talk about begins in the late Ottoman period. In the late Ottoman period, Macedonia is neither the state of North Macedonia nor this Greek province, but rather this broader territory that includes what is now Greek Macedonia, that includes the Republic of North Macedonia, and also a little bit of Bulgaria. So it's a much larger thing, and I would suggest that Macedonia has been partitioned along with the name Macedonia. It's sometimes people want to tell me that this is some sort of Bulgarian propaganda. It's really more just the past understanding. And as evidence of that, I'll give you this Greek map. It's a very low quality scan with this distracting shape that is damaged to the image. But this is the outline of Macedonia on this map. So you can see that it's very similar to the Bulgarian Macedonia. Final thing to know about Macedonia at the late Ottoman period is that there is no administrative unit called Macedonia. Macedonia is an entirely Ottoman region. Anything that isn't Ottoman is not Macedonian as of 1890. The Ottoman administrative units, the Iliad of Kosovo, the Iliad of Monastir, and the Iliad of Salonika, but there's no administrative unit called Macedonia. All right, okay, so on to the administrative questions.
We can't hear.
Hello? Hello?
Excuse me,
Yes.
Alexander. We could hardly barely hear you. There's a problem in the sound.
Is this better?
The
No,
sound
it's
is
still-
coming through very crackly, Alexander.
Yeah, correct, exactly.
Uh,
Sorry.
I'm not sure what to do. Do you have any suggestions?
Do you have a headphone set or something like that?
Let me get my headphones set. We'll see if it helps. I'm sorry for this interruption. Is that anything?
It might be a little bit better, but it's still quite crackly.
Oh. Let me stop sharing and look at my
Oh, it's
sound.
better.
Okay,
It's better,
much
right?
better now. Much
Yeah,
better
way
now.
better. Yeah. Thank you.
So
Thank you, Alex.
my PowerPoint damages the sound. Sasha, I can
You're
now
mute.
you're on mute, Sasha.
Sorry, or it might have just taken a second for things to settle down and now it's back under control. So
I will try to start my PowerPoint again. We'll see if it helps. Can you hear me
I
now?
think yes, yeah, we hear you okay, yeah.
Bloody hell. Okay, yes, I'm very, very discombobulated here. Share screen. Can you tell me what your screen shows?
presenter view. We're seeing 2 slides.
2 slides. Okay, let me try this. Share screen. How is that?
Fixed now.
Okay.
Is this still okay?
Yes.
Yeah, we see the map, yeah.
I apologize for these technical problems. I'll just carry on with my talk where I was. Now that we've looked at these terminological issues of where Macedonia is and the different meanings geographically of Macedonia, let's talk about the peoples or nationalities or ethnicities that live in Macedonia. It's a very difficult thing to try and discuss any population statistics about Macedonia because there's so much propaganda from the period. You can find pamphlets from Bulgarians claiming the following Bulgarian figures, pamphlets from Serbs claiming the following Serbian figures, pamphlets from Greeks claiming the following Greek population figures, and they disagree about the most basic things, even when they say these are the claims based on the Ottoman census. All of these claims must be false because the Ottoman census didn't use ethnic categories. The Ottoman census actually used the millet categories of Islam, Rum, Bulgar, related to the churches that people belonged to. But if we're interested in ethnicity, then we need to go past these census figures anyway, because the census is a very crude test of people's ethnicity. I think it's helpful to look at what foreign observers have to say. I think a Bulgarian or a Greek or an Albanian, we always have to wonder if they're increasing the value of their own numbers, of their own ethnic group as imagined. And I think if you have a person like Arthur Evans, for example, who was a an English archaeologist who was excavating in Macedonia at this time and made comments to the London Times. He had the following things to say: there's no such thing as Macedonians. He thought there were various peoples living in Macedonia. He lists Bulgarians, Greeks, Turks, Albanians, and Sephardic Jews in Thessaloniki, but there are no Macedonians. So he viewed Macedonia as a place in which many different ethnicities live, including Bulgarians. So insofar as there are Slavs in Macedonia, according to Arthur Evans, those Slavs were Bulgarians, but the Bulgarians are only one element in the mixture of this very multi-ethnic region. Now, Arthur Evans, of course, does not speak for the Macedonians themselves, and it isn't difficult to find Macedonians from the late Ottoman period who articulate a Macedonian particularism. The most famous is Georgi Kulevsky, who wrote a grammar book, a dictionary of the three languages of Macedonia, namely Macedonian, Albanian, and Turkish. Here's a sample passage from that dictionary. He says, "The nation is a people who have the same stock, who speak the same language. Macedonians are a nation, and they live here in this wonderful Macedonia." So it's as clear an evidence as you could ask for of a Macedonian particularist nationalism. But there is also the question of representativeness. You know, there are always oddballs who have obscure national ideas. Do you know that Kulevsky spoke for the masses, or did he just speak for himself? It's clearly didn't speak for all educated people in Macedonia, because you could find Bulgarophile texts from other Macedonians. Here, for example, is a folk song collection from Berkovic. It's the national folk songs of the Macedonian Bulgarians. And there's a key passage in there where he says that if you ask a Macedonian Slav, "What are you?" you will immediately get the answer, "I am a Bulgarian, and my language is Bulgarian." He only acknowledges Macedonian distinctiveness at the dialectical level. But once again, we have a question of representativeness. Frankly, the bit of propaganda from a Balkan author that I find most persuasive as concerns the nationality of the Slavs of Macedonia comes from a Serb. This is that Serb, Trgoran. He is trying to argue that the Macedonian Slavs are Serbian, and he wrote a whole series of books to that end, complete with an ethnographic map, which is very exciting. But the interesting thing about Gopčević is that his argument is so incredibly unpersuasive. Let me give you a sample passage from his book, from his travel book. He describes going to a small village in Macedonia, and he asks people, "So, are you Albanians?" "No, we're not Albanians." "Oh, well, so you're Serbs then?" And they sort of look at each other very awkwardly and finally say, "Well, maybe we're Serbs, but we are used to saying we were Bulgarians." And then Gopčević comments how terrible it is that these poor Serbs don't understand their true nationality. Take this man, Ivat. He spoke the pure Serbian. He knew it was Serbian. He knew the Bulgarians spoke differently. And still, even though his heart he was Serb, he said he was a Bulgarian because that was the custom. Now, I find this very unpersuasive evidence of Serbian feeling. I find it actually evidence of Bulgarian feeling, that he met someone on the street and, "Where are you from?" "I'm a Bulgarian." And the fact that it appears not in Bulgarian propaganda, but in the context of Serbian propaganda, somehow makes me more likely to believe it. Furthermore, the Gopčević view that the Slavs of Macedonia were Bulgarian at the time finds resonance in the foreign travelers who almost always describe the Slavs of Macedonia as Bulgarian. So let's look a little more at the Bulgarian nationalism in late Ottoman Macedonia. As many of the speakers at this conference have pointed out, the late Ottoman period is a time of lawlessness with armed bands, people making a living from working in armed bands, and so on and so forth, as our previous speakers so rightly pointed out. But those members of armed bands who are trying to be more nationalistic or come up with some sort of national justification, what sort of justifications do they have? I give you here the Constitution of the Bulgarian Macedonian Adrianople Revolutionary Committee. And the key thing to note about this constitution is that it claims to speak for the Bulgarians in this part of the world. So the constitution is for Macedonia in part, and it is to liberate Macedonia, but not in the name of Macedonians, but in the name of Bulgarians, who are, they believe, the largest single group in Macedonia. Here's an example of their newspapers. This is the Reformi. And a passage in this article says Macedonia has one element, which in its numbers and culture is in a position to obtain one government, the Bulgarian element. And of the citizens of Macedonia, this strong majority are Bulgarian. But I think it's also interesting that this same editorial proclaiming the Bulgarianness is also imagining Macedonia as a sort of multi-ethnic place. There's a sort of a celebration of diversity that we don't normally associate with Balkan nationalism. It says of Macedonia that Bulgarians, Turks, Greeks, and Wallachians have lived here from time immemorial, and isn't it wonderful that Macedonia has such diversity? Furthermore, they boast that the revolutionary organization they set up in Macedonia, though mainly Bulgarian in its support, has also won support from some non-Bulgarian elements. Isn't it great that there are some Jews, some Greeks, some Albanians who want to support the Bulgarians, the majority of Macedonia, in this glorious cause? So there's a Bulgarian nationalism, Bulgarian particularist nationalism in the context of Slavdom, but also a certain multi-ethnic, civic nationalism, if you will, in the sense that they want to have alliances with non-Bulgarians. This also plays a key moment in an uprising remembered as the Ilinden uprising. It's a very important moment in the memory of North Macedonian state today as the glorious uprising and so forth. The most dramatic success of the Ilinden Rising was a republic in the town of Kruševo, which lasted about 10 days until the Ottomans suppressed it. They issued a manifesto, which has been reprinted. Here is that manifesto. And there's again a key element here where it says the manifesto addresses the Turks of the region. And it says, "We have not raised our rifles against you, our fellow Turks. That would be shameful. We have not raised against the peaceful, diligent Turkish people who live among us. It's only the Ottoman government we don't like." So even at this most violent moment, there's I think, a rather surprising element of multiculturalism to the Bulgarian nationalism in Macedonia. Now, foreign observers looking at the Kruševo Republic and the Ilinden Rising described it as both Macedonian and as Bulgarian. It's the Macedonian Revolutionary Committee because it's in Macedonia, but the people who are doing it are Bulgarians. And here in the German press as well, the Macedonian movement consists of Bulgarian insurgents and Bulgarian bands. Now, the failure of the Ilinden Rising does lead to an early and famous exposition of Macedonian particularism from one Kirsti Mashukov, here pictured, both the portrait of him and the statue of him that currently exists in Skopje, the capital of North Macedonia. Mashukov, in the aftermath of the Ilinden Rising's failure, writes an important book called On Macedonian Matters, Zamarkanovki Raboti, which has been translated into English. So I'll give you the original Bulgarian text with the English translation. So he says this to say, and I find this fascinating. He argues for a Macedonian particularist nation, and he gives the following argument. What kind of national separatism are we considering? Are we creating a new Macedonian nation? Surely that would be artificial and short-lived. And anyway, how can there be a Macedonian nation when we and our fathers and our grandfathers and our great-grandfathers have always been called Bulgarian? So this is how he imagines his critics. And he answers the critics as follows. The first objection, the Macedonian Slav nationality has never existed, may be answered as follows. What did not exist in the past may be brought into existence later, provided the appropriate historical circumstances arise. It's very much a modernist and constructivist theory of nationalism, which I find very surprising in the from the pen of an actual Balkan nationalist from 1903. But I think it's interesting because this is someone arguing for Macedonian separatism, and he also concedes, oh, we and our fathers and our grandfathers and our great-grandfathers have always thought of ourselves as Bulgarians. It's fair to note also that Mashukov himself, after the Balkan Wars, returns to the Bulgarian fold. Here's a letter from Mashukov, and he signs his name as a Macedonian Bulgarian and a member of the Macedonian people who are Bulgarian. Now, of course, things changed during the Balkan Wars. It changed not only Mashukov, but many things. I guess in this audience, everyone knows that the Balkan Wars consists of Serbian, Bulgarian, Greece, attacking the Ottoman presence and destroying it. This is remembered in Macedonia, in North Macedonia history, as the power grab of these small powers. Here is a picture of it from a Macedonian history textbook, and you can see the wicked Greeks, the wicked Serbs, and the wicked Bulgarians reaching out their villainous hands to tear poor Macedonia asunder. In the Macedonian patriotic circles, you can often find a map that looks basically like this. This shows the partition of Macedonia, the Greeks taking the southern bit, the Serbs taking the orange bit, and the Bulgarians taking the blue bit. Now, as far as I can tell, the blue bit, the so-called Vardar Macedonia, that's here in Macedonia, has basically become Bulgarian, which isn't so surprising given the strong Bulgarian feeling that exists among the Slavs there when it was annexed to the Bulgarian state. But if we look at the Vardar Macedonia, which is to say the orange bit that later becomes the Republic of Macedonia, in the interwar period, it's annexed directly to Serbia. And the Serbs imagine it simply as Serbia. They call it Southern Serbia. So how do people feel about being Southern Serbs in the interwar period? Again, we have a wonderful account from a very clever and thoughtful traveler, Rebecca West, whose Black Lamb and Gray Falcon is a great pleasure to read for anyone interested in Balkan history. Rebecca West traveled through Macedonia, as you can see in the front piece of the map, and in Macedonia spoke with several people about their national loyalties. In Kumanovo, she met someone who said it's impossible to make peace with the wicked Bulgarians. The Bulgarians are our non-brothers. Those wicked Bulgarians, we want nothing to do with them. Meanwhile, in Bitol, she met someone who said, it's a shame we don't belong to Bulgaria because we're all Bulgarians, and that would have been better if that would have happened. And in Veles, she meets a very explicit claim to national indifference. I'm not a Bulgarian patriot. I'm not even Bulgarian. It's time to stop thinking of such things for their Serbo-Bulgarians. We should recognize we're all human beings, which is a wonderful sentiment from the Balkans. Now, the idea of Macedonian particularism does attract the attention of one major political group in Macedonia in the interwar period, and that's the communists. So the communists seem to take the view that the Bulgarians are claiming Macedonia, the Serbs are claiming Macedonia. Let's just split the difference. And one Macedonian communist named Dimitar Vlahov has this to say in his memoirs. One day in 1086, his formal consultation would be held. Inner leadership of the Center Committee of the party reached its stand on the question of the Macedonian nation and published it was concluded there is a Macedonian nation, separate from the Bulgarian nation, separate from the Serbian nation, and thus it is decided. Here is the issue of Makedonsko Dielo, the organ in question, and it has some interesting things to say. It attacks equally Belgrade's tyranny and the revolutionary proto-heroes from Sofia. It is anti-Bulgarian. It is anti-Serb in the sense of a communist opposition to all non-communist governments. And it invokes a Macedonian nation and Macedonian national consciousness. Now, the communists don't have the whole of public opinion behind them, but they do have some. And this is, I think, the first political party in Macedonia to actually promote the Macedonian particularist nationalism in any sort of mass way. Now, the next major milestone in the creation of Macedonian particularism is the Second World War. Macedonia is occupied by the Bulgarian army in the Second World War. The Bulgarian army occupying Macedonia at the partition of Yugoslavia depict themselves as liberators of Macedonia from the evil tyranny of Belgrade, and they claim that the Bulgarian nation in Macedonia will be free. The newspapers of the day have this sort of thing to say. They boast about the unification of the whole Bulgarian nation, including that bit that's in Macedonia, and the struggle for freedom, meaning the struggle for the Bulgarian rule. But the trouble with this period is that the liberation of Bulgaria coincides with the Second World War, and that it is done under the leadership of Hitler's Germany. So when the Second World War ends, and Hitler and all of his deeds are discredited as thoroughly as they are, then the idea of the greater Bulgaria is also discredited. The other interesting thing that happens is that the communists come to power. Specifically, Tito comes to power. And the communists had long taken the position Macedonia is neither Bulgarian nor Serbian. And so Tito, even during the Second World War, gets a committee together to create an alphabet and standardization for the Macedonian language, thus giving a linguistic particularist dimension to Macedonianism as distinct from Bulgarians. The Republic of Yugoslavia that Tito sets up declares Macedonia one of the constituent republics, separate from Serbia. And then the interwar Yugoslavia, or the post-war Yugoslavia, promotes the teaching in schools of a unique Macedonian language with a unique Macedonian alphabet, and creates this ethnic Macedonianism, which builds, I think, on a sense of regional loyalty, but also destroys the sense of Bulgarian particularism. So what I think is interesting about this story is that it succeeds. And the idea that the Slavs of Macedonia are Bulgarian, which once seems pretty widespread, given the context of widespread national indifference, which we should assume by default, it vanishes entirely. And this Macedonian particularism, this Macedonian separatism, achieves such a rapid success. Now, from the point of view of Bulgarians, this is, of course, all this terrible nonsense. Particularly conservative Bulgarians tend to view Macedonian particularism as some sort of evil trick done by Stalin that no one should take seriously. This Macedonian nation doesn't have any long roots. It's sort of fake and doesn't matter. But I think we need to distinguish the antiquity of Macedonian particularism from the authenticity of Macedonian particularism. The fact that people are happy to be Macedonian now, that the ethnic loyalty to the region of Macedonia, a Macedonia previously imagined as a homeland for many nationalities, but now imagined as the homeland of a particularist, unique nationality, I find that a fascinating story. And so that's what I wanted to share with you today. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you, Alex, and sorry for the technical hardships.
I apologize for the technical difficulties. I'm sorry that things were interrupted.
That can happen. It's a wild Zoom world, it happens. And so our last but not least panelists are Sebastian Meredith and Sasha Davis. Let me introduce Sebastian. He's a PhD candidate and sessional academic at the University of Newcastle. Sebastian's research chiefly concerns the convergent histories of the European Union and East Central Europe from the mid-20th century into the 21st. His recent publication in East European Politics and Societies, the EU, the Visegrad Group, and the Southeast Europe Conflict and Perspectives within an enlarging European identity, which highlights the confluence of economic processes and discourse on identity in the intra-EU politics. With Dr. Sasha Davis, Sebastian has also investigated the historical relationship between the Bulgaria and the European great powers and the ways in which West European projections of Easternness have affected Bulgarians' long-term development and integration. So Dr. Davis completed his doctorate at the University of New South Wales and the lectures in European history at the University of Newcastle. His primary research interest examined minority nationalism and the state in the east of Europe, with a focus on German diaspora communities, coercive regimes directed at Rome in the post-Habsburg lens. He has also written on the Transylvanian Saxon diaspora in North America and the co-CA in the Oral History Project, German as a Heritage Language and Culture in Newcastle, and the Hunter Valley, which is a really interesting project he's undertaking. Sebastian and Sasha, floor is yours, please.
Thank you, Umit.
Thank you.
Okay. Now I'm just going to share my screen. Sorry, apparently I just need to give... Oh, no, hang on. Actually, Sasha, would you be able to share your screen? My computer is chucking a bit of a tantrum about this.
Okay.
It's making me update the whole thing and get out of here to do it.
Yep. Yes, give me 1 second. Share screen. Share.
Okay, there we go. All right. So, in the 1870s, Bulgarian nationalists in Ottoman Rumelia positioned their campaign for independence as a Western Christian struggle against barbaric Oriental Turkish oppressors. This Orientalist rhetoric galvanized the local Slavic peoples. It attracted great international attention, and it granted the fledgling Bulgarian nation the legitimacy of great power recognition and support. This support included, most crucially, the Russian military intervention that secured Bulgaria's independence, and was accompanied by widespread ethnic cleansing that halved Bulgaria's Muslim population. Throughout the following century, Bulgaria existed in the geopolitical orbits of Imperial Russia, Weimar Germany, Nazi Germany, the Soviet Union, and the European Union. Throughout this period of shifting core patronage, while anti-Turkish Orientalism remained a frequent theme of Bulgarian nationalism, anti-Turkish violence and outright ethnic cleansing largely remained absent from public policy. From the 1970s, however, anti-Turkism re-emerged with a new vigor, growing steadily in both prevalence and aggression, eventually culminating in the violent persecutions of the revival process in the late 1980s. The first Bulgarian regime rose to victory on the back of anti-Turkish rhetoric, and another Bulgarian regime imploded entirely while employing strikingly similar rhetoric.
And this raised some questions for us. For instance, why did anti-Turkism fail in the 1980s when it had succeeded in the 1870s? Why did Todor Zhivkov's communist regime employ the rhetoric in the first place? And what about the 100-year gap in the middle? Existing scholarship generally explains Bulgaria's fluctuations of anti-Turkism via one of two schools of thought.
Okay, so the first school of thought emphasizes cultural explanations for the phenomenon. Inspired by Edward Said's Orientalism, Maria Todorovas theorized that Southeast European peoples were treated as a kind of hybrid peoples, somewhere between the civilized West and barbarous Orient. She contends that ethnic Bulgarians internalized this notion, which then reinforced anxieties around cultural identification. Mary Neuberger also locates the cause of Bulgarian anti-Turkism in internalized cultural anxieties. And she asserts that Bulgarians' supposed hybrid status created a constant pressure to construct a cohesive non-Oriental identity, and this has led to the construction of Bulgarianness, or Bolgarnost, in opposition to the Turkish Orient.
The second school of thought emphasizes political economic explanations. Viktor Bojkov describes a communist party terrified by the decline of the Soviet bloc on which their economy relied. Consequently, he argues, anti-Turkism emerged to mitigate the loss of legitimacy in the eyes of a struggling public. Richard Crampton also argues that the BCP pursued vigorous anti-Turkism to distract the ethnic Bulgarian majority from the economic and political decline of the Soviet bloc. He describes a cynical attempt to rally public support for the regime by beating the nationalist drum.
Okay, so we argue that neither of these standpoints are sufficiently comprehensive. Instead, we explain that the multifaceted problem of the Bulgarian rhetoric, we use resonant twin lenses, world systems theory, first of all, for the economic relationship, and Orientalism for the cultural elements. So world systems theory outlines a hierarchy of nations, and in which every region on Earth has hegemonic core powers that shape the flow of resources within their sphere of influence, or their periphery. Lower on that hierarchy, peripheral powers attempt to gain power and legitimacy by maintaining their relationship with one or more core powers. Throughout the remainder of this presentation, we will outline Bulgaria's balancing act as it attempted to navigate a region dominated by the European great powers. Bulgaria's use of Orientalist rhetoric emerged only when it was understood by the Bulgarian elites to be fundamentally useful to the Bulgarian nation, as it were. That is, either to preserve those elites' position within Bulgaria or to preserve Bulgaria's position within Europe.
And to make it clear, we're specifically using the idea of Orientalism in terms of Said's understanding of Orientalism. We recognize that it doesn't always have that sense in some other languages. So the Bulgarian nationalists of the 1870s constructed a sense of Slavic Bulgarian commonality in opposition to Turkishness. The Slavic population of Ottoman Rumelia was not all Christian and did not all speak a uniform dialect. But what Christian Slavs did have in common, however, was a sense of disenfranchisement by the Ottoman state. In essence, a class struggle against Turkish elites became couched in nationalism, aided by Orientalist rhetoric. The Orientalist dichotomy of the civilized West and the barbarous East appealed to Bulgarian nationalists not only because Bulgarians could feel good about their own ethnicity in an environment which otherwise belittled it, but also because it could be used in turn to appeal to the greater powers of the West. In April 1877, following the massacre of Bulgarian revolutionaries remembered as the Bulgarian Horrors, Russia stepped in as the self-appointed defender of the Christians and declared war, successfully forcing the Ottoman Empire out of what would become Bulgaria. Ethnic cleansing accompanied Bulgarian independence, halving the new state's Muslim population.
The national revival embedded into Bulgarian nationalism the potential for using Orientalist rhetoric to legitimize anti-Muslim action. The national revival was mythologized and made into a foundational element of the education system. Nonetheless, anti-Muslim policies remained relatively restrained due to at least four pivotal factors. Firstly, by gaining their independence, the new Bulgarian state moved from an internal periphery of the Ottoman world empire to an external periphery of the European world system, and particularly to Russia. It was not in Russia's interest to provoke a new war with Turkey. Rather, Russia sought stability as it solidified its hegemony in the Balkans. Secondly, the Ottoman Empire remained Bulgaria's primary trade partner due to a lack of Russian investment in Bulgarian industrialization. Thirdly, Bulgaria was surrounded by military threats. A Serbian invasion in 1885 and the subsequent shifting sands of the Balkan Wars alliances from 1912 to 13 confirmed Turkey as merely one of many threats. And finally, Bulgaria's new Christian elite merely supplanted the former Muslim elite without making any major economic reforms. And this redirected peasant resentment from the former Turkish elites to the new Bulgarian one. But even so, there were instances of anti-Turkism in the years after 1878, whenever it was considered useful to the preservation of that Bulgarian elite. During the Balkan Wars, Turkish populations were forcibly relocated to Turkey, and over 200,000 Muslims were forcibly converted to Christianity. Russia's failure to come to Bulgaria's aid in the Second Balkan War, however, quickly ended these policies. Bulgaria angrily severed ties with its patron and chose instead to enter Germany's sphere of influence.
From 1913, Bulgaria existed on the German periphery, and German hegemony only strengthened the constraints on anti-Turkism. Germany and the Ottoman Empire were allied central powers, leaving Bulgaria on the same side as its former imperial oppressor in the First World War. Germany invested enormous sums in Bulgarian infrastructure and primary industry, and Bulgaria became relatively tolerant of its Turkish minorities. Those who'd been forcibly converted during the Balkan Wars were now allowed to revert to Islam. Even as the Central Powers faced defeat in 1918 and the Ottoman Empire approached dissolution, the friendly relationship between Germany and Turkey meant any attempt by Bulgarian elites to stoke anti-Turkism would be a foolish gesture of self-alienation.
After the First World War, Bulgaria lost territory to its Balkan neighbors, but not to Turkey. Throughout the 1920s, Bulgaria became irredentist and diplomatically isolated, a periphery without a core. Trade with the European centre dried up, leaving only agricultural trade with its Balkan neighbours, who were also its rivals. And without any stable core to depend upon in this period, Bulgaria experienced a long decade of political instability. Short-lived governments often shored up domestic support through nationalism and Orientalist rhetoric. From 1927, anti-Turkism resurfaced in the national curriculum, which included a teleological narrative of Bulgaria's destiny to join the community of advanced Western nations. And they were very specific about this, referring to Italians and Frenchmen. From 1931, the Bulgarian National Socialist movement began attracting significant support under the slogan, "Back to the Revival." And this was a direct reference to the Bulgarian national revival of the 19th century, and it indicated a clear desire to ethnically purify Bulgaria. From 1934, successive governments began surreptitiously monitoring Muslim minorities as a Turkish fifth column. Despite this clear upwelling of anti-Turkism, the governments in this period largely prevented anti-Turkish rallies from taking place and tried to avoid antagonizing Turkey too much. After all, Turkey remained their most important trade partner, and it crucially didn't occupy any of their claimed territory, unlike their Christian neighbors.
From 1934, Germany's new Nazi regime poured enormous investment into Bulgaria, while also pursuing friendship with Turkey. This made it obvious that anti-Turkism continued to serve no useful purpose if Bulgaria wanted to fulfill its territorial ambitions. Bulgaria pinned its economy to Germany's, with approximately 60% of all trade occurring with Germany alone. That German investment was put to use militarily as well during the Second World War, not against the Turks, but against Bulgaria's Christian neighbors, taking southern Dobruja from Romania and large parts of Macedonia from Greece and Serbia. But we all know how the Second World War ended, and soon Bulgaria found itself on Moscow's periphery once again.
From 1944, the People's Republic of Bulgaria followed the Soviet model. As Bulgaria developed on the Soviet periphery, its rapid industrialization became a powerful legitimizer of the BCP. However, the Soviet model of industrialization did not allow for large investment in consumer goods. So nationalism remained ever present as a vehicle through which the regime preserved its influence. Special privileges were afforded to party members who were disproportionately ethnic Bulgarians, and cultural policies continued to enshrine Bulgarianness as a touch point of commonality that was essential to the success of communism. The Committee for State Security was tasked from the late 1940s with monitoring Bulgaria's Muslim minorities. Muslims were treated once again as a Turkish fifth column. From 1950 to 1952, the BCP encouraged more than 160,000 Bulgarian Turks to migrate to Turkey as part of the collectivization process. This was until Turkey closed its border. From 1952, a new curriculum outlawed religious education entirely and instructed that Islam was an alien imposed religion that had slowed Bulgarian development for hundreds of years. Despite these manifestations, Soviet doctrine nominally encouraged the pursuit of international communism. This limited the extent to which anti-Turk policies could be applied. The 1947 Dimitrov Constitution also guaranteed Turkish cultural rights and representation in the nomenclatura. Consequently, anti-Turkism mostly remained a surreptitious affair.
This changed from 1971 as the Zhivkov regime ratified the so-called Zhivkov Constitution. And this erased the minority protections of the Dimitrov Constitution and introduced escalating anti-Turkish measures, reaching a climax in 1989. From the 1970s, significant trends within the USSR made anti-Turkism appear increasingly useful to the Bulgarian regime. So firstly, under Brezhnev, the Soviet economy entered a long, slow decline and began treading water by exporting raw materials to the West. Bulgaria, too, padded its ailing economy by reselling Soviet petroleum products to the West and also to Africa. And then the Soviet policy of Russification emboldened Bulgaria to enact similar reforms. These included eliminating non-Bulgarian languages from education, banning the use of the Turkish language in public, limiting Turkish access to jobs and public services, diluting Turkish citizens by placing them in majority Bulgarian areas, and even forcing citizens with Turkish names to change them to Bulgarian ones. Naturally, this repression caused civil unrest. In response, communist elites turned to escalating nationalism.
And that brings us to the so-called revival process. So finding it untenable to blame the USSR for their problems, Zhivkov gave a speech in 1984 that targeted a much less threatening scapegoat, the Turks. A policy of ethnic cleansing began. Zhivkov castigated the Turks as a primitive Oriental burden and asserted that the Turks were really Bulgarians who had not yet experienced the national revival. The regime signaled its own victimhood in this process. According to the official line, the Turks assimilated us. Now we will assimilate them. Our backs are against the wall. We have no place to retreat. Throughout 1984 and 1985, everything Turkish was eliminated from civil society. By the end of 1985, Zhivkov declared, "There are no Turks in Bulgaria." Any Turks who refused to be assimilated after 1985 faced violent repression, incarceration in forced labor camps, or outright deportation. But nonetheless, protests and civil unrest still continued. Finally, in May of 1989, Zhivkov gave a televised address ordering all Bulgarian Turks willing to leave to do so immediately. Over the following 6 months, more than 250,000 Bulgarian Turks were forcibly removed from their homes and sent across the border into Turkey. This process, which essentially removed 10% of the Bulgarian labor force and prompted broader protests from sympathetic Bulgarians, resulted in the collapse of Zhivkov's regime and a transition to democracy.
In his resignation speech on the 24th of October 1989, Foreign Minister Petar Mladenov attacked his party's policy, stating, "We have reached the point when we are estranged from the USSR and we find ourselves entirely on our own in the same pig's trough as the rotten dictatorial family regime of Ceausescu." Mladenov paved the way for Bulgarian elites to abandon Zhivkov's anti-Turkism, allowing the former leader to leave in disgrace. Immediately following Zhivkov's exit, anti-Turkism seemingly evaporated from public discourse. Like the other nations of the former Warsaw Pact, democratic Bulgaria pivoted westward, attempting to integrate itself with the vibrant economic core of the EU. Integration with the EU requires that one not openly engage in ethnic cleansing. Minority protections are enshrined in the EU's Copenhagen criteria. The uselessness of anti-Turkism since 1989 is self-evident.
Okay, so the key difference between the purpose of anti-Turkish discourse in the 19th century versus the 20th was the direction of center-peripheral movement intended by the Bulgarian elites. In the 19th century, Bulgarian elites advocated for a shift of centers away from the Ottoman Empire and towards Europe. In the 20th century, however, the BCP attempted desperately to avoid such a shift and to preserve the status quo. And these instances of anti-Turkism are best explained by viewing the actions of successive Bulgarian regimes through these lenses of Orientalism and world systems theory. Although Orientalist anti-Turkism was a crucial component of Bulgarian national identity construction during and after the national revival, its rare emergence in public policy indicates the role of Bulgaria's peripheral status in influencing its domestic policy. Upticks in anti-Turkism generally occurred whenever Bulgarian interests aligned with those of its core, as in the 1870s, or when it found itself cut adrift from its previous core, as in the 1920s and again in the late 1980s. Governments from radically different classes and positions on the political spectrum all resorted to similar nationalist anti-Turkism during these unstable periods. Conversely, whenever Bulgaria has clearly existed on the periphery of a core power, its elites have restrained this tendency towards anti-Turkism in order to better reap the rewards of those politico-economic relationships.
Thank you very much. Now, I think we have around more than 20 minutes, Sasha, or do we have more time for Q&A?
I think I think we can take more if there's questions. We can just play it by ear, I think.
Okay, perfect. Sounds great. Okay, please, any question, any comment to make and raise?
I have a question for Spiros, if I may. Or perhaps more partly a comment as well as a question. I found this idea of these entrepreneurs as groups moving through through these shifts in regime really interesting, especially given the large migration of often of people from Yugoslavia, often people from the right of the political spectrum from Yugoslavia to Australia after the Second World War, and the involvement of nationalist organisations in Australia after that period. So I guess one thought that comes to mind is, have you looked to see whether these whether these elites continue to operate, perhaps not violently, but although there have been cases in Australia, but rather in the context of the emigre politics that follow on afterwards. The other thing that came to my mind is I found this idea of economic entrepreneurs really interesting, and I think you can see a parallel not just with these people who are not necessarily committed initially to nationalism, and also with the nationalists of the more established middle class that are already in business and are, if you like, in many ways the driving force of the nationalist ideology, because it seems to me that they too are engaged in this nationalism. This is sort of where Sebastian and I found ourselves after looking at the period of independence, very much engaged in a process of using nationalism to remove their competitors in the Ottoman elite and remove the restrictions that they felt were on them and avoid interference from the Ottoman state. And I don't want to suggest that their nationalism was merely motivated by economic interests. We just seem to note how often economic interests and national leanings seem to go together, if I can put it that way.
Okay, thank you, Sasha, for a very interesting comment and a very interesting question. Speaking about this elites and what they did in the diaspora, I have 3 examples. The first example comes from the Bulgarian elites, the old Imro cohort. After obviously Bulgaria became the socialist bloc, many of them moved to Greece. Others moved to Italy. A small number moved to I think Austria, they were all very active until 1951, 1952, when they organized excursions inside Bulgaria. The same thing was undertaken by IMRO. I know that Albanian nationalists were actually spent a few very eventful years in Crete, where they were trained by the British and the Americans. They were sent back to Albania proper, where they did very badly indeed. And the most prominent example is if you look at the interwar Ustasha, they moved to Austria in 1949, and there you have all these octogenarians by the 1970s who coordinate kind of atrocities within Yugoslavia, the derailment of trucks, of trains. You see political assassinations of Yugoslavs in Sweden, in Germany. So these are very, very kind of criminal prone. And again, what for me, and I don't want to overextend this, but if you look the origins of diasporic organized crime, they come from these people because they have the skills and the ability to move between the world of politics, the world of violence, and they have, Croatian nationalists in, for instance, Austria. Again, I'm not speaking for ordinary Croatians. I'm speaking for a cohort with Ustasha roots. They were very much involved in setting up organized crime brackets within the community and later on. And we see this with Yugoslav diasporas in the 1980s and in the 1990s. So for me, there are definitely ties, and there is definitely an institutionalized memory of doing these things in Southeastern Europe, in the Balkans, and to an extent in the Middle East as well. The second question, obviously business elites went hand in hand with these people, with these military entrepreneurs. Nonetheless, there is a big difference. Let me take a Bulgarian example. Obviously, you have the businessmen in Sofia, either for reasons of patriotism or for reasons of profit, who collaborate with these people. The difference is, if we look at Pyrenean Macedonia, that becomes a part of Bulgaria, the people who actually become the entrepreneurs there are the Bulgarian diaspora who leaves Greece in the 1920s, or the old IMRO people from the area. And for me, what is very interesting, if you look at Pyrenean Macedonia, IMRO sets up this semi-independent state. They control business activities, and the old IMRO kind of people on the ground, they become businessmen. And this happens here in the Balkan Wars. I mean, my favorite IMRO kind of character is Apostol Petkov, who was almost completely illiterate. He is a man of extremely violent temperament. And he, by 1910, I think he owned properties and shops in Sofia. And he was engaged in business in Ottoman Macedonia proper. And for me, Apostol Petkov, he died, I think he died in 1911, I think, 1912. Anyway, he's kind of one of these prototypes, the guy who moves from being semi-literate kind of thuggish character to a guy who owns property in the Yanica area, in Sofia, in Ottoman Macedonia. He kind of encapsulates this. So I think they went hand in hand. The difference is, I think by the interwar period, definitely in Bulgaria, because IMRO is anyway a big story, the old military entrepreneurs, they displaced parts of the old middle class, or they merged, or they even become a new elite, especially in border areas. The same thing I think happens in Yugoslavia, and I find the same thing in Greece. That these old people, because in the border, violence matters a lot when it comes into business. And if you control the means of violence, you can control who takes what. And just to include this, I came across a very interesting example. I came across a veteran paramilitary, the 1920s. He goes out in the local capital of Ioannina, and a lawyer had sued him because he was trespassing on his property. So this old paramilitary attacks the lawyer, begins to beat him on the street. He is protected by the state, and he tells the lawyer, now, you see what I had to do, go to the courts, see if I can be ever tried for what I've done. Obviously, he wasn't. So for me, these military entrepreneurs actually displace the old middle class. And one of the very interesting parallels for me, I think the Balkans should be seen in comparison with areas like Mexico or the American West or Argentina, where we have the expansion of settler colonialism, post-colonial states, expansion of all these men, these very violent men. I think Apostol Petkov has very interesting parallels in why interpret his brothers, men of violence going west, becoming entrepreneurs. And this is a big story where the Balkans fit within a global history of state making, state breaking, capitalism, and so on. Again, thanks for the interesting question, and sorry for the very long answer. It's just
no, thank you for a fascinating response.
Roger, and then Hans Lucas, please.
Thank you. I'm afraid my question is also to, I just want to get it right, Spiros. My question really arises from a comment you made earlier about militias in the Balkan Wars and so forth, and arises actually from my looking at the Balkan Wars through the prism of Trotsky's writings. And I found it most interesting that he commented on more than a few occasions, or observed that the Ottoman Empire had a core army and so forth, but it also had these militias. I think one of them, you may well, I'm certain Hans Lucas would know, I think they're Janissary or something like that. But there are across all these Balkan states, particularly during the Balkan Wars, you have a core regular army, but then you have these poor militias that are can be mobilized. I think you used the term paramilitary mobilization or something like that, to supplement the army, the core army. And they may or may not be paid. But when it came to the atrocities that Trotsky in particular was documenting, then he observed, yes, the regular armies carried out these, would carry out atrocities, but actually, if they did so, these militias, if you like, were even worse. And sometimes they were so bad, the regular army would have to bring them to heel by crushing them. But these people would rob, rape, do anything. So it seems to me that's reflective of the weak states that existed in these poor countries. They weren't in the position to maintain a huge base, a huge state army, at least on a prolonged basis. So they depended on these ancillaries, let's call them that. And I presume that's the feeding ground for the kind of phenomenon you're talking about of military enterprising and so forth. I'll leave it at that.
I think state weakness is only a part of the answers. Let me get an example of the state that not at the moment, but Britain. Britain was a centralized state, has a very long standing army, but nonetheless, Britain used paramilitaries in Ulster, which was just next door. It was kind of a 40 minutes fly away from London. It was not this lawless area. Paramilitaries are used by the state either as force multipliers, as Trotsky suggested, because of state weakness. They are also used because they can do things that the state cannot. They can murder with impunity, and the state can simply say, these people are uncontrollable. It's not my fault. I tried to crack down on them. I never intended them to do this. Also, paramilitaries, even they cannot be controlled even by a strong state because they function in a clandestine way. How can you punish somebody that doesn't exist on paper? How can you charge somebody with a military law offense that's not officially part of the military? That doesn't even exist on a military roster. So for me, yes, Trotsky was right in kind of mapping this, but I think it's not just state weakness. And I think that using paramilitaries is a part of the state repertoire, both centralized states and weak states, strong states and weak states, and they're used for a variety of reasons. Force multipliers, controlling marginal areas, and simply outsourcing violence that cannot be done by the police. I mean, how can you murder kind of an IRA politician? You cannot. But paramilitaries can, because they do not exist on paper. How can you murder a North Macedonian activist? You cannot. You must bring him to the courts, right? But paramilitaries can murder him, and the state can say, this was not a political murder. This was just a criminal affair. How can you blame me? I'm not even paying these people. They're uncontrollable elements. So I think, yes, Trotsky has a very good kind of conception, but there is, I think, a broader story. Thank you for a very interesting question, Roger. And I hope this kind of addresses more.
Thank you for your presentation. Prigozhin and the Wagner group spring to mind, but I won't say any more.
Exactly.
Hocam?
Yes, also thank you very much for brilliant papers. That brings us, I think, also to our core question, also the late Ottoman Empire as a world of violence. And so even if we have to contextualize and relativize and so on, there is an experience of violence, and it's not only border violence, so Balkan violence, it's internal violence. And so just to remind, these are these huge anti-Armenian pogroms in the 1890s, and there are, of course, a lot of entrepreneurs of violence within the empire, not only at the margins. So to put it bluntly, or a little bit way of provocation, all these post-Ottoman states had to bear the legacy of an experience of extreme violence, often extreme violence, and perhaps sometimes one does not enough think about this, because I would argue that the violence destroys democracy, or it takes a lot to overcome the experience of violence, and to be for a society in a situation that allows these consensus finding negotiation that is required for a democratic social contract. So yeah, I just wanted us to bring a little bit back to the core question. And even if I think it's brilliant your paper, Sebastian and Sasha, let us not forget about the experience, the lasting experiences and traumas of violence. So all the factors you list are important and convincing, but there is also our key theme today, that is violence and the experience of violence and the use of violence. So all these entrepreneurs of violence are those who know this art and make a living of this. And this is, of course, anti-democracy. It is, how to say, a huge potential of anti-democracy for generations. Yeah, just a small input and question at the same time. Yeah. Can we explain certain basic things by just seeing a world of violence that is very hard to overcome?
It's a very, very good question to contemplate. I know that the Bulgarian horrors, if we stick to this example, linger enormously in the Bulgarian consciousness. They even today, if you talk to a Bulgarian person on the street of Stara Zagora, they'll still tell you that the Turks engaged in sort of 400, 500 years of slavery, and will mention the massacre that occurred in the city in 1877. So it is certainly a legacy that lingers. It's the question that I suppose we were investigating was not sort of why the resentment exists, which I think ties more strongly to that. But what are the key catalysts that make it palatable to suddenly appear in civil society at any moment in time? Do you want to add anything, Sasha?
To some degree, I think this goes back to the very first paper we had today from Philip, and the role of ideology.
You're too soft, Sasha.
Apparently, if I put the microphone near my mouth, it works better. Who knew? Sorry. So yeah, no, I agree with what Sebastian has just said, and I think it's a really good question. And I think this goes back to some degree to the paper we first heard at the very beginning of today from Philip, and the role of ideology and legitimizing ideology. And I think we can absolutely see that the traumatic experiences of the late Ottoman period absolutely created the conditions for an ideology that then used in the very broadest sense of ideology that then gets used again and again to justify retaliatory violence, right? And I say retaliatory, but that's how it's represented. You know, we're doing this to protect ourselves because of the things that they've done to us, right? And we have no choice. I think the trauma point is a really interesting one, because one of the things we see is that in the period of the initial, the initial struggle for independence, if I can say, we're seeing that ideology is persuasive to a section of the population, right? And we're seeing relatively effective mobilization. But I think we can say that by the time we get to the 1980s, that trauma is a historical memory. It's no longer, it's absolutely not a lived memory anymore. And that is certainly potentially one of the factors in why we see considerably less support for the exclusionary policies at that later date. So certainly, I would agree that the historical memory of trauma and the actual experience of trauma play an important role in the legitimization of violence. That having been said, that legitimizing force is presumably there fairly constantly, and though gradually declining, and yet we only see violence at certain moments, and that's where I think the model we're taking helps explain why you have the particular moments of violence.
Can I possibly make a comment?
Yes, please go ahead.
In relation to what Hans Lucas and noted, and what Sasha and Sebastian said, I think there is not just a trauma, there is an institutionalization of violence memory. Do not forget that in Bulgaria, during the Zhivkov pogroms, one of the key moments was the film The Projection Time of Violence, which was a film narrating an idealized history of violence, counter-violence in Bulgaria, based on the 1960 novels from a failed judge, a failed jurist, who became a violence entrepreneur by publishing very bad novels with heroic victims and traitors and saviors that could be mobilized. At the same time, the pogroms, because there were pogroms, as you know, I worked in Bulgaria for some time. Stara Zagora, for instance, where pogroms took place, the removal of Turks, of Pomaks, of Muslim Roma, was also applauded by local society because they simply took over the businesses. Even in the south, it was very much scaled, and the return was precluded, because also the people who threw them, the state that threw them away, distributed the property. So I think it's not just, I think you make a very good point with the world system, but it's not just a trauma, it's an institutionalized memory of committing and mobilizing violence, both for ideological and non-ideological reasons. As Hans Lucas said, it is present in the area and can be mobilized at will. Without this institutionalized memory, not just trauma, but of doing things in a specific way outside the purview of the state, violence cannot have happened, because there is trauma, historical trauma in other areas. But this kind of pogrom, this kind of mobilization cannot happen unless you have this memory. And we can say that in contemporary Bulgaria, this memory still exists. If you got Stara Zagora, it is one of the more nationalist areas, both for the trauma, but because nationalism is very good, from football hooligans to local businessmen, excluding the Roma from access to the market. It's actually good practice if you want to profit from it. Same goes, I think, for the South, and so on. The same goes if you're a kind of a businessman, subcontracts a kind of who uses kind of Turkish women workers or Pomak women workers. So it is a practice. I think it's an institutional practice in the Balkans that explains this. It doesn't matter if time has gone by. Even if you look in a different context, American militias and how they're used, 1776, it's a very old time, but the institutionalized memory of using weapons, of attacking the state, of being militant, and of using violence as profit, as mobilization, I think has an extreme potential that can, as Hans Lucas said, it can be detrimental to democracy. But for me, if I can be a bit provocative, it can be conducive to a specific type of democracy. De Tocqueville saw a very democratic America and a very violent America, but it might be conducive to a specific type of democracy, of exclusionary democracy. A democracy that is being built on us, isolating, throwing away the others to build a democratic state. So again, we can even question the idea of democracy, I think, and the democracies as they exist and as they're being built while interacting with these violent memories and institutional practices. Again, great paper, Sasha and Sebastian. It was kind of very nice to think about it.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Just to kind of briefly.
Yeah, of course. Go ahead.
Yeah, I just wanted to sort of briefly build on that. The around that time, just to sort of go on the idea of cultural memory, from the 1971 Shivkov Constitution, there were a series of republications of revolutionary texts, sort of, that were originally published in the National Revival. There were a series of textbooks as well, and sort of published in that decade, leading up to the main revival process, the sort of big outburst of violence, that sort of worked very hard to remind Bulgarians of their Bulgarianness as a specific oppositional identity to Turkishness, I suppose. I might leave it there in the interest of brevity.
Sasha, you want to add to that?
No, I think it's just to say on that it's a really good point, and I think the institutionalization of practices of violence is something that we hadn't thought of, and I think it's something that we've really, Spiros has made a very persuasive argument about it, and I found that I found that really interesting. I actually wanted to ask a question of Alexander, if I may. I found myself in the very rare position of being charmed by nationalism. It's very rare that I find myself looking upon nationalists and going, how nice, right? It was fascinating to see Macedonians presenting this very, or Macedonian nationalists presenting this very multicultural view of Macedonian nationalism. What I'm wondering is, as we see the process of moving from a kind of regional identity to emphasizing, a separate language or dialect, or however you want to, however the Macedonian nationalists choose to frame this, and sort of laying down the foundations for an ethno-national Macedonian identity. How much of the multiculturalism survives, or does that all fall by the wayside?
I think it pretty much falls by the wayside. I mean, I would love to tell you some happy story, but it's not. I think the people who are most keen on Macedonian multiculturalism, if I don't know, maybe that's not the best term, but it'll do for getting on. Their main thing is they don't want Macedonia to be partitioned. Mesirkov says if all of Macedonia went to Greece, no problem. If all Macedonia went to Serbia, it's fine. If all Macedonia went to Bulgaria, it's terrific. The difficulty is if Macedonia is partitioned, then our homeland is ripped asunder. That's what they want to avoid. And they know that there's lots of Greeks in the south of Macedonia. And, there's Turks and Jews and all these other people. And so I think this is why they're imagining something multi-ethnic, because if we start thinking in terms of ethnic purity, well, then that means partition.
Thank you.
I think the other thing that's interesting about the story is, all the theorists of nationalism talk about, in the West we have civic nationalism and it's all, the French Revolution and wonderful, and those nasty East Europeans, they have this ethnic nationalism. If you look for the so-called civic nationalism or multi-ethnic nationalism in Eastern Europe, you do find it. I mean, they don't win in the end, but part of the reason they don't win in the end is because of the Treaty of Versailles and the Paris Peace Conference. The Western powers prevent civic nationalism from working. Anyway, it's one of my pet peeves. Anyway, thank you for your question.
Roger, please.
If I may take us back a step, provocative seems to be been used a couple of times. Hans Lucas, you were couching the question of violence in the post-Ottoman, in the Ottoman period, and it's in the core of the Ottoman state in its latter years, and that you were also I think you were framing it in terms of its consequences for democracy or otherwise. Two questions, if I may, or issues. One, I mean, the formation, let's call it democracy, of democracy in the West, one only has to think of the United States, War of Independence, Civil War, and we see right now, I don't know, what is it? More than 100 years. No, it's not 100 years. No more. Since the Civil War, so we see these elements arising throughout dismay in contemporary US that can hark back to that memory of a civil war, for example. Very reactionary elements as far as I can see. So that's just one observation. In other words, I guess the point is, to what degree are we really talking about something, are we talking about a unique phenomenon, or are we talking about a sort of a global issue here? But to try and make it a bit more concrete, isn't there an issue in terms of, particularly in terms of the Ottoman Empire, with an empire of some kind, maybe it's a tributary one, I'm not sure, in decline and under siege, basically, from powerful enemies, and within that, the attempted emergence of nation states in a very, frankly, inhospitable environment. Not only the emergence of, let's say, the Young Turks and what they're trying to do, but within the Balkans and so forth. So I just wonder whether it's that attempt at, let's call it, belated nation-state formation that adds to the intensity of the violence that you're thinking about, we're thinking about, if you like, as a whole. So I don't know whether that's provocative or not. Thought I'd put it out.
Is that question for me?
No, I'm happy for anybody to. But if you like, you could start the ball rolling. But look, we've got all these informed people here, I'm sure.
Also perhaps everybody should switch off the micro, because I had echoes now in the.
Yeah, I'll turn mine off.
Yeah, so everybody should, if not speaking, switch off. Also, I think it's just about taking stock of facts of violence and but also of systematized violence. So there is, of course, I would not now insist on a uniqueness. I would just insist on the intensity and on the victory, the diplomatic victory also of violence, at least to a certain extent, than in Lausanne. So where it was just a question of who won finally a war in Asia Minor for this co-region of the Ottoman Empire to be remade. And there were genocidaires then in the new state also. So there are then a lot of distinctions we can make, and especially, of course, with Spiros's also approach, how much continuity is there, personally and politically, and in the way how polity is imagined. Is it just a question of like is imperial power at the end being the stronger one in a struggle? Struggle can be peaceful, but they are not, of course, if it is power in the sense of imperial power. So, of course, my image or my understanding of democracy is not 100% the American one, because the USA never started as a democratic social contract for all people concerned on that territory. So that's, I would say, even the birth problem of the United States to this state. Yeah. So that's enough. Anyway, I think it would be dinner time, isn't it?
Yes, I think we can adjourn this session for the time being.